So good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar for Next Patient Week. Today we are talking about the new generation of wearables in AI and how they are bringing digital therapeutics and clinical trials to the next level. My name is Gabriela Salvatore and I'll be your moderator for today. And I'm joined by a panel of Bert Hartog, Francesca Rucche, and Ben Sperling, and each of them will introduce themselves in just a moment. For those of you participating today, please feel free to take advantage of the question panel and let us know what's on your mind. We'd love to hear from you and be able to engage with you through the question panel. So with that, let me ask Bert if you would please introduce yourself and just let us know your answer to the question, how are wearables and AI bringing digital therapeutics and clinical trials to the next level?
Thank you, Gabriela. Very happy to. Thank you for having me, and welcome to the fellow panel members. Nice to be here on a very cold Friday afternoon in Europe. Hopefully getting some warmth from the audience here in this virtual setup. I'm part of the Janssen Clinical Innovation Team, and our job as part of the Clinical Development Organization is to build capabilities for doing clinical trials different, to make clinical trials more attractive to participants, both patients, healthy volunteers, but also investigators, and allowing new science to be part of clinical trials. And that's where many of these digital solutions come in. Specifically, my focus in the Clinical Innovation Team is on digital health solutions, where I'm looking for the application of technologies to basically do two things. One is to enable remote monitoring of patients, to be able to collect data from a distance with sensors, with wearables, where participants don't have to be in the clinic to allow data to be generated, but also in clinic where nursing staff or clinicians don't have to be near the participant to collect the data. It can be done by the technology and be presented through dashboards for actioning. The second use we are investigating is around digital biomarkers, where we start measuring what cannot be measured otherwise. Think about activity, think about sleep, think about the patterns of walking. There's a whole range of new opportunities becoming available. And the additional benefit there is that you can start bringing objectivity in some of the patient-reported outcomes, where subjective measures replaced or complemented with technology can give you a more objective insight, which allows physicians to base their decisions on the combination of patient experience and quantified objective sensor measure. So getting into the next level of clinical research is really the result of that, enabling use of these technologies in a setting where the data meets the regulatory requirements. That's the important aspect. You can do the best research in the world, but if the regulators don't accept it, it's wasted effort. So all these factors need to come together. That's what we work on, and that's what I'd be very happy to talk more about later in this webinar.
It's wonderful, Bert. Thank you so much. Can we turn to Francesca, please? Francesca, would you mind introducing yourself and answering the same question about how wearables and AI are bringing digital therapeutics and clinical trials to the next level?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Francesca Rucche. I'm the Chief Digital Officer at Almirall, based in Barcelona. Our mandate is really the end-to-end digital transformation of the company. So everything from establishing a data analytics platform to back office process automation, as well as process automation within the manufacturing space. Within R&D, we're looking at how we can improve drug discovery using AI, and certainly a huge focus is on software-enabled clinical trial solutions to try to bring efficiencies both in terms of time and cost to our clinical development programs. We're also on the cusp of launching a novel digital therapeutics platform and project, which will be associated with one of our products. Hopefully we can share more information with all of you early next year about that. And then from a commercial perspective, we're looking to find digital solutions and services to get closer to our patients and our providers using a variety of different mechanisms. With regard to how digital solutions can be brought to clinical trials, prior to joining Almirall, I was leading European investments for MSD's Global Health Innovation Fund, where part of my investment focus was on next-gen clinical trials and software-enabled clinical trial solutions. So, I think it's an enormous area of potential innovation within the pharma industry, but I think we need to be a bit braver and start deploying and employing some of the solutions that are at our disposal. And certainly with regard to digital therapeutics, I think there's certainly a lot of buzz within big pharma and also small pharma, mid-sized pharma, and I think it's really exciting to see the level of clinical innovation and also the level of interest from our pharma partners in that space. I really do see it as the next wave of medicine. We started with small molecules, went to biologics, cell and gene therapy were next, and now I feel digital therapeutics are really at the vanguard. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Ben, can we turn to you and ask for your introduction and also the answer to the question how wearables and AI are bringing digital therapeutics and trials to the next level?
Sure. Well, my name is Ben Sperling. I'm the Managing Director of North America for Chronolife. Chronolife is a healthcare artificial intelligence company that has developed some remote monitoring and predictive solutions. So we have a customizable, washable, smart t-shirt that measures 6 different physiological parameters along with a tunable predictive algorithm. So, we believe that data from wearables will bring significant value both from clinical trials and to digital therapeutics. My background has really been focused on in the healthcare continuum of applying what I call hidden data to clinical digital support, clinical support applications. So wearables is one of those key elements in which what we could see with a clipboard in our eyes that would take forever to document, we can now consume a vast amount of hidden data about people's movement, their temperature, their EKG. There's so much that we can learn and how they apply. And as I think about as we move from the payer's perspective to an outcome or a results-based payment methodology, I think about them wanting real evidence that there's effectiveness with medications. And so having data about someone's physiological state, either continuous or even in a spot check method, gives the ability to intervene early if the medication isn't being effective. And so I'll give you kind of one example. I may be a rapid metabolizer of a certain drug. My body, my DNA tells me that I'm going to chew it up and I'm going to need more of it to get the effectiveness of it. And so having a wearable can show that, let's say it's a drug for movement and I've taken the medication and after an hour and a half, I become sedentary again. It's one indication that, hey, maybe I need to do some more checks to see if I need to adjust the dosage or whatnot. So there's lots of things that can be done. I think it's just finding the right use cases and looking at it. And I think the panel will agree is technology isn't the solution for everything. You have to apply the right, you look at the problem and apply technology as appropriate.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. We actually have our first question from the audience, which is from Rob Wilson, R&D lead at Health Mode, who's wondering how will COVID-19 impact decentralized trials and accelerate adoption of digital endpoints and real-world, real-time data? So Bert, can I ask you to start off with that question?
Sure. Could you repeat the first part of that question, Gabriela?
Of course, absolutely. How will COVID-19 impact decentralized trials and accelerate adoption of digital endpoints and real-world, real-time data?
Okay. Yeah, that's a very topical and very good question. COVID-19 has resulted in a lot of things, but one I would like to kind of isolate is that COVID-19 has revealed some underlying issues in the way we do clinical research. And COVID-19 put the spotlight on things that could have been, maybe should have been improved a long time ago. The sheer fact that patients in the COVID setup could not make it to hospital because it wasn't safe, or because there was no capacity, or because they didn't feel comfortable doing so, or because they were not allowed to make use of public transport, all result of the pandemic. And therefore, treatment could be done in a home setting. That is something that could have been done before COVID. And the fact that patients appreciate this flexibility needs driven because of COVID, but that is not new. Patients have asked for this before. So COVID has revealed some of these opportunities. And because of COVID, and because COVID lasted more than a few weeks, we've seen solutions implemented that are more than just band-aids. We've seen solutions implemented that are actually the beginning of sustainable new ways of working. Sustainable new ways of working that post-COVID can be looked at as an alternative or a complement to the more traditional ways of working. I don't think we need to shift the entire model, but I do think that we need to keep some of these emergency measures that were taken during COVID and turn them into future-proof, sustainable alternatives, additions to the traditional way of working, where we supplement everything that can be done in a hospital setting with alternatives outside the hospital setting and additional measures that can be taken where the hospital is just not the right place because of the environment. So I think in that, call it a silver lining, in that sense, the entire shift from everything hospital-based to a lot outside the hospital, assessment, medication shipment, you name it, all of that we need to seriously consider keeping as an additional capability for future clinical research design.
Thank you. Ben or Francesca, anything you'd like to add to the response to this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a COVID perspective, it kind of forced the healthcare continuum to make an investment that they weren't really planning on making just now. So the whole e-visits, remote monitoring, I mean, certainly there's reimbursement for it through some CPT codes through CMS, but it's like the electronic medical record. Once the investment was made, certainly we leveraged the heck out of it, right? And so this is an example of another, because of COVID, it forced us into making the investment and learning and getting every really caregiver involved in some sort of fashion of remote monitoring or e-visits. But now that we have it and we've made the investments and people have the learning curve, I believe we've gotten over it. Now we can think of, you know, creative ways of using it, whether it's pre-screening, whether it's, you know, initial visits for in a care setting for a pre-surgery, or, you know, you're having complications and from a medication and you want to have an immediate virtual visit. So, you know, although, you know, COVID has been tragic in many different ways, it did force our hand into evolving.
Great.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think, you know, I fully agree with all of that. I think COVID has been a bit of a catalyzer, but it's also allowed the narrative to change a bit, because people have become more accustomed to the way we've worked during this time, and that's allowed for conversations around, you know, hybrid clinical trial models and other things within our industry to really get some serious weight and serious discussion, and I think that that will change the way things are done going forward, and certainly the rationale for them that goes without saying.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you,
And maybe, Gabriella, if I may, there's another aspect I would like to highlight that you don't often hear mentioned, other than in complaints, and that is IT literacy and the infrastructure, the backbone infrastructure for virtual meetings and like today's session. Because of COVID and because of the necessity for people to work from home, we have seen tremendous increase in people's ability to make use of technology. People are much more comfortable doing video calls. People are much more comfortable working from any location and kind of change the working processes to become much more location independent. I think that is both an IT infrastructure and a more people cultural change that will last well beyond COVID, and that will help operate at a higher level of technology and a higher level of literacy in using technology that we will all benefit from.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've extended the geographic region in which the reach in which we can get to people, right? I mean, with mobile being so prolific, we could have these conferences, you know, if I'm in Africa or if I'm in, you know, Europe or in the US, in any kind of region. So that gives the ability for us to extend our reach for clinical trials, therapeutics, or regular, you know, general care.
Mm-hmm. So there's another question from our audience about regulators. And so the question reads, sure, but will regulators also change, and how can we engage them? And I know, Bert, you were going to talk a little bit about how you build the use case for technology to be used in trials. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that from a regulatory perspective. And then we'll hear from other people.
Interesting question. And I would love to better understand the background of that question, because I would argue it's not the regulators that stand in the way of implementing technology. The regulators may need to prove a few more cases where technology has been used successfully and the data was accepted, but it all starts with offering the data and the insights to the regulators so they can respond to it. I think the regulators have actually done a pretty good job enabling the use of technology in research. FDA has been very active for many years, offering guidance, offering instructions, participating in workshops and public fora to explain what they deem acceptable and what the criteria are. And there's been much investment in other parts of the world with regulators really trying to understand how technology can make a difference. I think the ball is in the courts of the healthcare providers and the farm companies to start doing this. And to that extent, what we've started at my company in collaboration with many others, including Francesca here with me on the panel, is we've started looking at how can we build a framework where we can demonstrate the evidence required to use technology in a trial setting, where you need to prove, much like any other assessment, but in technology it's a bit more complicated because there are different levels of evidence that need to be provided. You need to first demonstrate why a certain measurement in the context of a certain disease is relevant. And then you need to prove that your technology generates data that actually generates insights to get an understanding of that setup in that disease. Is it a high rating? Is it a low rating? Does it change over time? What's the meaning? What are the increments? Is a small change, a rapid change? All these factors that come into play in understanding the measurement. All of that needs to be tested, needs to be proven, evidence needs to be created. That's a lot of work, and much of that has not been done for much of this new technology. So we are working on a concept where that work can be done through services. So you don't have to do it yourself, you can procure it, and a marketplace where that work can be shared. So once done, everyone can use it with some construct where you may need to pay for it, or you may be able to hire it or borrow it or look at it. But the transparency is key, so you limit redundancy. And then you can also look at you can also deal with the related problem that's unique to technology, and that is that it never stops changing. Any device you use to generate data in a clinical context is subject to hardware upgrades, software upgrades, the algorithm gets better with more training data. So it's kind of a moving target where you need to do equivalency studies to show continued relevance of your technology. So by the time your study is finished, the technology has reached a new level, you can do an equivalency study to make sure that people using that upgraded version actually know what they're looking at in comparison to the evidence you generated on an earlier version. So that marketplace, that ecosystem, which we hope to bring to the ecosystem over the course of 2021, that should help make this more of a professional environment with services, with catalogs, you name it. And I think that will help accelerate the adoption of these technologies, because people will feel more comfortable and the regulators can look at it with some level of understanding that if it comes from that ecosystem developed with these protocols according to these standards, that should give it a certain weight, a certain meaning, which will hopefully take away some of the reluctance where people don't know what to expect.
Thank you for that. Francesca or Ben, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think the normalization of a lot of these solutions is really what we need for pharma to move forward with them. You know, when putting my investment hat on, when we were talking to pharma and trying to pitch, you know, this with the startups, we would often hear things like, well, you know, this is a really important study, so I don't want to put it at risk and try some digital thing. And that's exactly the opposite approach that we need to embed a change within the setting. And so I think, you know, I really like the approach that Bert is taking in terms of you know, that normalization, that collaborative approach to validating some of these solutions, I think is the right step forward. But I think we also need to be a bit braver in terms of deploying them and trying out different things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from a medical device perspective, there already is comparable medical devices, even as you change form factors, right? So there's heart rate standards, there's temperature standards. These are already published. So then you have something to benchmark. So as our company changed the form factor to dry sensors into a fitted washable t-shirt, we had a gold standard to measure against to prove that our accuracy was there, right? And you can just extrapolate that with any company and any new sensor. Like, so there's comparables to it, just how we apply them. Is it, you know, a spot check or is it continuous, right? And how would that apply to the specific study? So I don't think it's a technology issue. It's more of the, I think Francesca used the right word, the braveness to do it, right? And if you are concerned about, hey, I'm trying something new, it's a smaller study. Maybe it's a parallel study, right? To prove that, you know, we know from a technology perspective, it's been validated, there's evidence. Now I'm going to apply it to my study, and you know, I may run a couple different cohorts to try to prove it out. So it's about being brave. It's leaning into, you know, new data and new insights.
Great. So Francesca, we were going to ask you to talk a little bit about how you keep patients at the center and not get caught up with just cool new technology. But before we get there, we have a question from someone online who's asking, When I collect a lot of data via my sensors, will I become the owner of that data? And can I decide which research projects to donate my data to and to which commercial projects I expect revenue, either money-wise or early access to research results? So Ben, can we start with you, the question of data ownership and fair market value?
That's a great question, and I have had many of conversations about data ownership, and I think they would range from constituents to constituents. But you know, how data is collected, it's who's paying for that data to be collected, and what you know, as we have smart watches, we're sharing that data and rights to that data with Apple and Fitbit and Garmin, right? They're leveraging that in a de-identified way. I think that's from a comfort perspective. Is you as an individual, do you feel like you want to you know, for the greater good, let your data be applied, right, in aggregate, in a de-identified way? You know, so the payers are certainly paying for that data. You know, they're reimbursing for care. Should they have a right to leverage that data? You know, you would think for your care you would. They need to be able to use the data. Now, ownership and selling it are kind of two different things, right? So the right to use and the right to sell. That's a pretty a tough question, because many of business models for companies have been built on, you know, the right to sell. I think, you know, right to use in applying it to support the mission is important, right? The monetization of it for the individual, we'll see where that goes, and that could go more broadly, not just medical, but also social networks of your data. And there's been quite a bit of debate around that you are the product when you're on social media.
Mm-hmm. So Francesca, let's dive into this question about how we keep patients at the center as we deliver novel therapies.
Yeah, well, you know, I think with digital therapeutics in particular, it's quite easy to, and it's almost a requirement of, to have the patients, to treat the patients in a really holistic way. So if we think about treating patients with chronic illnesses, rather than just treating, you know, mechanistically the root cause, a lot of the existing digital therapeutics and those that are currently in development address the psychosocial impacts of the chronic disease on the patient. So, you know, my area of focus is medical dermatology and in psoriasis, as an example. Depending on what patient population you're looking at, the over 60% of patients have issues, mental health issues, either anxiety or depression, as a direct result of their condition. So having a digital therapeutic that can address that. Interestingly, in psoriasis and also in atopic dermatitis, the stress and the depression are direct triggers that make the condition worse. So if you can manage the psychosocial aspects, you actually are better managing their disease. So it's treating patients holistically, but looking at it from a very clinical endpoint driven approach to ultimately get the patient the best level of care that they can get. And the way we're treating patients now doesn't necessarily take all of that into account.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from our audience about the role of consent and what is the level of patient consent when thinking about these technologies. Do you want to take a stab at that, Francesca?
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, you know, the consent is the same, and we shouldn't think of that as a stumbling block. You know, we have to consent patients just as we would for a clinical study, or, you know, we have to inform patients when they're taking a new medication, make sure that they're aware of the potential side effects. So, you know, I think similar to that with a digital therapeutic, we would employ, you know, the same metrics. my sense in talking to patients and in the studies that I've read is that patients are not opposed to consent to their data, to release their data as well, because of the greater good it could provide, from a societal point of view. So, I think we certainly have to consent and make sure that they're aware of what they're signing up for. But I think it's certainly not an impediment for implementation.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So from the audience, one person wanted to offer a resource, which is the Digital Medicine Society Playbook. They say it's a tremendous resource that speaks exactly to Bert's points on considerations for evidence and digital deployment. So for those of you who are interested in more information, Digital Medicine Society Playbook is the resource that was cited. So let me now, if I can, turn to you then and ask, what are the trends that you're seeing in terms of virtual trials? Is this the wave of the future, or what's your thoughts on that?
Sure. There's been significant investment in startups like a Science 37 and others to support virtual clinical trials. And major CROs are investing in these type of companies too. And honestly, we'll see likely acquisitions in this area. But I don't think we're at critical mass with these just yet. I think we're at the very beginning of it from an adoption cycle. All the major CROs right now support a library of devices and wearable technology. And so they have kind of middleware type platforms to be able to consume this type of data. And so there's recruitment benefits, there's data benefits. So I think that we're at the beginning, but this is something that will definitely grow, and because of our now comfortability with virtual and working remotely, this will lead to a higher adoption rate in this area. So,
Bert, how about you?
Also,
oh, go ahead, Francesca.
Sorry to interrupt. I think also the incredible increase in telemedicine, depending on region. If we look at the U.S., the increases have been 150-fold during the time of the pandemic. I think that that virtual delivery of medicine will also help virtualize trials, because again, as patients become more accustomed to it, they'll be more apt to participate virtually. So, and then as a result, so too will the pharmaceutical companies and CROs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. And maybe let me just build on that, because I think frankly, virtual is not the answer. I think hybrid is the answer,
Yeah.
where we need to see what we can virtualize in trials. And what I'm hoping is that with the learnings from the pandemic and all the work on virtualizing trials that already started before, going back to like 2018, 2017, when much of this already started to appear in the clinical research domain, I'm hoping that every new study protocol from now on will be looked at for opportunities to virtualize components and maybe even offer patients choice. Do you want this assessment in clinic setting, or do you want this assessment in a home setting? Where possible, of course, because sometimes regulations, sometimes safety drives a certain assessment in a certain environment. But if every protocol is going to be designed with that lens to try virtualize what's possible to benefit patients without putting the integrity of the data at risk, that would be a massive step forward. And ethics committees and IRBs can actually help there. They could look for, is there an opportunity here to facilitate patient access to the trial even more than traditionally possible? So we could build in feedback mechanisms where the design to be tested by IRB, EC, could be tested for some of this virtualization that patients, I hope, are going to start expecting to be part of the setup. So that could really drive a different way of working away from these traditional hospital-based trials.
I think the hybrid approach is really good from the perspective of getting a glimpse of what's happening in a patient or a participant's life, the social determinant side of seeing what their living setting looks like, and adding, kind of additional context to the picture of your trial also makes a lot of sense, right? So I don't see I see this nothing but growing, this sector, and the new context that we have, I think, is going to really aid in drug development.
Mm-hmm. Francesca, you sounded like you were agreeing there for a minute. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, and I think to Gabriella, to your point earlier about really walking the walk and keeping patients at the center, offering them options about how they want to be treated within the context of a clinical trial, I think will also increase participation and hopefully as well increase the diversity of participation within clinical trials, which, as we all know, is certainly lacking.
We have a question from the audience, which I think, Bert, if you could start the response cycle, that would be great. And the question is, what do you think of synthetic control arms with RWD in clinical trials?
Yeah, good question. That is one of the clear advantages of developments in the AI world, where we have electronic medical records quite prevalent across the entire globe. Actually, we have the sophistication in AI to know how to process the data that we find in these electronic health records. There is still a fair bit of curation required because the data is often not standardized. It's not easily accessible at kind of an aggregate level, but we are making inroads in understanding how to harmonize this and how to generate insights from these data sets. Based on that, we are beginning to see more and more clinical trials where the control arm or the control part of the trial is no longer an active recruitment part of the trial, but it's actually extracted from these electronic health records. And that's where the synthetic control arm comes in, where you don't need to, you can limit the size of your recruitment cohort because you only recruit for the active treatment, and you compare to a control arm that you extract from your electronic health records to get your real world data. Conceptually, that's quite accessible. We've seen examples where it's been done in regulated trials, in phase 4 trials. And I think this can scale massively to become a real important part in minimizing the need for recruiting people into trials where you only need exposure to the new medicine, and everything else, comparing to placebo, comparing to standard of care, could be extracted from these real-world data sets. There's a lot of buts and ifs, and it's not as straightforward as it may sound, but it's possible, it has been done, and we are seeing more and more of it. I think this could be a real significant change in the requirement for study participants, allowing more studies to be done because the studies will get smaller as a result. So very promising, and more evidence being generated to show how it can be done.
Francesca or Ben, anything you'd like to add to this conversation about synthetic control arms?
I think we'll have to see how the regulators weigh in on this. I think it could be an incredibly powerful resource. But again, I think there's hesitancy in deploying a lot of this because of putting the study at risk. So, I think we'll have to wait and see, but I think it could be a real movement forward.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let's talk about this topic that you raised earlier, Francesca, about the potential innovation within pharma and maybe some of the concerns or hesitations or risk aversion that you sense in the industry, and how you are thinking about ways to push things forward on the innovation front.
Yeah, I think we just have to start doing. It's as simple as that. you know, there's been a lot of talk for a very long time around how best, you know, to approach these things. But I think ultimately we just have to get it done and start showing the value and the impact that we can have. And also, one of the things I encouraged, you know, the startups that I was on the board of to do is to demonstrate the value, the cost savings and time savings, and what that could mean from a value increment, you know, when presenting to pharma. Because I think, you know, the model's a bit broken, and the way CROs are contracted is it doesn't disincentivize them, if you will, to have delays from taking recruitment as an example, from a time to recruitment. So, you know, creating different reward structures whereby meeting the requirements is the baseline. Any delay causes a, you know, a decrease in payment. Any improvement causes, you know, some kind of a milestone or something. So I think thinking through different ways of approaching, you know, the core of how we're managing clinical trials, I think is really needs to happen. And hopefully soon we'll start seeing some of that, you know, more of a shift to hybrid trials, virtual trials when they're possible, deploying different types of technologies, both for, you know, patient recruitment, for patient-reported outcomes, introducing real-world evidence and sensors and monitors into trials to give us a more complete view of the patient and the potential efficacy of the therapeutic being investigated.
Mm-hmm. For thoughts on this question of pushing innovation forward and how we help pharma to do that?
Yeah, many thoughts. I completely agree with Francesca, but I would like to add a perspective which is challenging, and we need to see how it can best be resolved, and that is the support that's necessary for use of technology. So imagine you're doing a phase 3 trial, you've got a couple of thousand sites, you've got tens of thousands of participants in 40, 50 countries, not unusual in cardiovascular, in some other therapeutic domains. If these study participants are using technology for study purposes, and that technology may require some level of control, maybe some upgrades, maybe some kind of oversight. Typically, the sites are not equipped and not interested in providing that technology oversight. They are doctors, nurses, they want to do medicine. So you need some sort of help desk equivalent to help people make use of the technology, to help deal with break fix, to help deal with upgrades, what have you. The logistics of that machinery, they become quite impressive quite quickly. Supporting one individual somewhere in the world, that's easy, but to scale it to 50,000 people who may require support, that could become quite expensive. I don't know how that has been resolved. I'm not aware of ways that have resolved this other than very expensive. Everything can be done as long as you're willing to pay for it. But the current model to support people in trials for some of their technology-related needs and requirements is not scalable. It's too expensive. It's based on a per-person cost, and we need to think about some exponential or some radical change to that model to really commoditize the support for people using technology in trials at a completely different cost level than what we see today. That is one of the hurdles that we face, where we need some, I don't know, maybe some different type industry collaboration, maybe some different type service provisioning, but that is a practical hurdle that stands in the way. When not cleared, and when you look at the sites to provide that type of support, the sites will be very disappointed because the sites don't want to become your technology help desk. They don't like that. They're not equipped to do so. It distracts from their mission. So it has to be complementary to the sites, but that doesn't really exist yet at an affordable price point.
Great, thank you. Ben, what about you, especially as a representative with the product that's on the horizon of innovation? What do you think about pushing pharma and the industry forward?
Well, I mean, I think that there's technology that exists that can help right now. Okay, it's about adoption, and to Bert's question, or possible issue is the support of that. And I've been involved with pilots and trials with medical devices in the pharma setting, in clinical trials. We do whatever we can to lock down that instance. That may be the mobile phone. That may be there's no upgrades to the medical device. So we've kind of locked down the situation until we get through certain hurdles, I guess. Now, it's a critical patch. It's a critical patch, right? But a lot of the sensors that we're talking about, they're mature in both firmware and their abilities and the data accuracy. With mobile phones, the industry has gotten very good at keeping a certain instance of a software platform through there's your mobile technology, security technology that can do remote upgrades if critically necessary. So it's certainly something that does need to be thought about, because the doctors do not want to do this, be tech support. But this is definitely not something insurmountable. The medical device industry has already thought through a proper way of ensuring integrity through a long clinical trial, 18 months, 24 months type of trial. So it's there. I think the pharma industry just needs to engage with the professionals to have this healthy dialogue and give them comfort that it can be done appropriately and safe without putting unnecessary burden on the doctors that are and the nurses that are conducting the trials. So from a trend perspective, I mean, we are taking a little bit of old and a little bit of new, right? So we are showing that it's grounded in sound principles, and so there's safety there. But from an innovation perspective, I mean, we have to change the way we're doing it. The costs are too expensive for us to get things in time. I mean, I think COVID is a perfect example of how important to get something out there rapidly. Now, we want it to be safe, so we want to have a lot of great data to support it to give people comfort. But like COVID, it was grounded in something old and something new. So we can give people a pathway of comfort to what's been developed.
I like that, Ben. And if I may jump on that, Gabriela, the farm has long been proud of being able to do clinical research according to GCP, according to all the regulations, etc. And medical device was looked at a little bit different for some time, because different regulations were in place for medical device research. Not so much anymore. Now the two are much more aligned. But I think the learning from device to farm isn't as optimal as can be. And maybe what you're describing, Ben, maybe that is one of the kind of actions that can be taken, like how do we accelerate the learning from device to farm to learn how to handle devices at scale in a complex environment, multinational, thousands of participants, etc. If device has cracked this, let's learn from it. Let's avoid reinventing the wheel and isolating ourselves. Let's find those experts, learn from them, and identify those best practices so we can apply them as quickly as possible.
Yep.
Great. There was a comment from the audience, Bert, actually, about your earlier statements around the support that is needed. And the question is, would that support possibly be part of CROs in the future?
Yeah, short answer is yeah, could be.
Yeah.
As long as it's affordable. What CROs do extremely well is scale to very large volumes. CROs can run trials in 50 countries in parallel. CROs can access resource pools that are very impressive. CROs have processes that scale. partly because unlike individual farm companies, CROs can see many companies' ways of working. So they can identify best practices among their entire customer base to develop their own practices on. So absolutely, CROs could be part of the solution. We just need to look at price point where to scale, it needs to be affordable.
Yeah, I have seen the CROs kind of step up and take that role. So they've created platforms or middleware platforms to consume, medical device data. They've normalized it. They have thought very thoughtful about, the target participant and, will this wearable, will they wear it? Can they wear it? Can they put on a watch clasp? I've seen very, very thoughtful conversations from them. So they have a really great idea in what works, what doesn't work. And so they're taking, medical devices through their paces, right? Now for them, they're building a library of medical devices that work, and they'll do smart textiles like a Chronolife, and they'll do other kind of wearables. They're driven by the pharma though. So the pharma says, hey, this is my use case, this is my demographic. It's an aged population with cardio problems, maybe poor dexterity. Okay, what can we apply to capture data, right? And so they'll say, okay, we've been talking to these companies, or this is the type of technology that could apply, and then they'll either do integration or already have the library of devices connected. So I do see CROs being very instrumental in this, kind of being quarterbacks for this process.
Francesca, do you have thoughts to add on this question of CROs being part of the process?
Yeah, I would agree. I think to some extent, what I find is that often CROs partner with startups to deliver what they need to abide by the contracts that they're signing with pharma, and very often, there are an increasing number of players involved, and to the extent that they integrate some of those digital solutions and services into their own platforms and processes, I think that will certainly streamline it. But if we continue to add complexity and have to kind of outsource all of the functionality that they need to drive a trial to completion, it will become increasingly difficult for them to do that and to provide that support. So there have been some acquisitions and some M&A in the CRO space, but in my opinion, not really enough of it, because a lot of the capabilities they just don't have themselves.
Great. So at the start of our time together, we were talking about how to make clinical trials that incorporate digital therapeutics more attractive to patients. So from your collective perspective, what are the kinds of things that patients care most about when it comes to wearables or digital therapeutics, and how are you taking that into account?
I think from a digital therapeutics perspective, having the recommendation of their physician in a study we recently did is really the number one. But of course that requires the physician to be convinced that that the digital therapeutic adds value. So I think at the core of it for digital therapeutics is the generation of the clinical evidence in support of the product as a therapeutic modality, and that's going to take some time to convince people, to convince physicians that that there's real value there. And I think it also requires pharma to prioritize and to think about digital therapeutics as just another quiver in their therapeutic armamentarium.
Mm-hmm. Bert, you were nodding your head.
Yeah, I completely agree with Francesca, and maybe the additional perspective is that patients need to recognize how the trial serves their interest. Maybe in addition to additional interest, But for example, when a patient suffers from a chronic disease, talks to their doctor about the disease, the signs and symptoms, and the doctor says, well, I can prescribe you a biological that will make your symptoms disappear. That doesn't always address the concern the patient has, because the patient may be concerned about fatigue, about sleep issues, about social mobility issues. And some of those are a little bit abstract for physicians to act on. And that's where these digital solutions can make a big difference by quantifying some of these complaints that patients have, or some of these symptoms that patients suffer from, and that before could only be measured subjectively. Patients could complain about fatigue, and the doctor would say, well, yeah, I understand. I don't know what to do about it because I can't put my finger on it. I can't quantify it. With digital, you can quantify it, you can start acting on it. So with transparency, where this is explained to patients, they recognize themselves in the trial that's offered, and then you can make the trial very attractive. And then the rest will follow by treatment decisions and what have you. So recognition that patients' needs are served through the trial, I think is a game changer.
Ben, thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think digital therapeutics is really interesting because it's very patient centric. It's got to be extremely usable. The UI has got to be super intuitive. Like there's no instructions that should ever have to be given if you're using an app for a digital therapeutic. It's just, it should be intuitive because of you, right? And Livongo is a great example of that. The other interesting thing about digital therapeutics is, and Bert kind of touched on it, it's a little bit about comorbidities. You have one thing that you may have that therapy for, but you probably have, you know, multiple comorbidities that can lead to other symptoms that you have to tackle and address if you want to really get to the heart of, you know, managing a chronic condition, a disease state. So extremely important. I would think about a condition and think about usability for all the comorbidities. And I think people like Livongo is getting it right. And there's other great examples, but that's just one that comes to mind.
So in our
I agree. I think it's all about, you know, the chronic care management and treating comorbidities and other conditions that might be kind of ancillary to the primary indication.
Great. In our last 2 minutes together, I'd love to go around the room and just have each of you share what your call to action is to your colleagues as relates to wearables, digital therapeutics, AI, bringing clinical trials to the next level. So Bert, can we start with you? What's the call to action to the community?
Absolutely. My call to action is twofold. One is for every new trial you design, think about elements of virtualization you can bring to the trial, be it in long-term follow-up, be it in assessments, be it maybe even in giving patients choice. So that's one, the virtual lens to your trial design. And the second one is when you look at assessments necessary for the disease you're studying, think about what patients care about, and think about, in addition to the regulatory clinical requirements, think about how patients live with the disease, experience the disease, and whether there's additional measures that with the advent of digital you can start quantifying that could make a real big difference in the ultimate treatment solution that you're developing to help people live a better life with their disease or where possible cure their disease.
Ben?
Yeah, I would echo a little bit of Bert's comments, which is, you know, start thinking about the use cases that you have and trying to add more color to it, more data, and how best to do it. And getting a sense of an individual's whole life with adding data will help, I think, get better clinical and financial outcomes ultimately for this. And I spend most of my day working with customers about like their use case and applying the right technology. And to be honest with you, there's no one technology that does it all. So, you know, get very specific and identify your problems and then think creatively.
Call to action, Francesca, in our last
I think
minute.
just do it. Just try it. And you know, I don't like the term pilot because I think there's too much pilotitis in pharma. But I think of it as a scalable experiment. So try it in a study with the view to expand it. You know, try it early with the view to expand it. You know, in your phase 3 study. Think about what is at the core of your patient's journey with regard to a digital therapeutic, and how can you create a solution that's either a wraparound solution with a more traditional therapeutic or as a standalone DTX to really get at the core of what that patient needs to live a healthier life.
Wonderful. So I want to thank the panelists, Bert, Ben, Francesca. Thank you so much for the dynamic conversation, and thank our participants for your questions and engagement. And thank you to Next Pharma for the next patient week. I hope all of you have a good rest of your day, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.